International law must protect humans, not dictators. Sovereign state is not a good enough principle or an adequate principle anymore. International law protects dictators to exact cruelty and punishment on their populations. A declaration of moral bankruptcy of our leaders, and I'm going to pick you up on that if I may in a moment, Wolfgang. Even if you look away now and ignore things like Syria and ignore some of the outrageous things that are happening in the world, you are guilty. So we've got a crisis of leadership. But before I come to you, Wolfgang, on that, let me just ask Michael Keating, who I've known for 30 years, but he has an extraordinary career, and he's just been in Somalia, but now is in Brussels. Just tell us in 1 minute what you do these days, Michael.
I spent most of my life working in fragile states. The purpose of the European Institute of Peace is to strengthen European capacity to resolve, prevent conflict, and to provide practical dialogue and mediation support. And I thought when I started that this was going to be about applying the lessons that I've had the privilege to learn in places like Afghanistan and Syria and Somalia and other places with a view to upping the game of Europe. And I've got to Brussels, and frankly, I'm actually quite shocked, because the assumption has been that Europe is a relatively stable platform from which to help the rest of the world resolve its problems. And the first thing I've discovered is that differences within Europe are compromising its ability to use its values, to use its economic weight, to use its political credentials to play a constructive role in many of these places. This has to be addressed.
Well, we'll pick it up because Wolfgang's put that on the agenda. But, I mean, would you say that Brussels is even more challenging than Afghanistan and Somalia?
There's no beach in Brussels compared to Mogadishu. I missed the beach. I was there for 3 years.
But in terms of conflict and adversarial?
Well, look, yesterday I spent, let me just very
briefly for the moment, please.
Yesterday I spent a day with representatives of 16 European states trying to figure out how to improve conflict prevention and recovery. And what I discovered is these officials, senior officials, are caught between a rock and a hard place. The rock is the reality on the ground in places like Syria, which have a certain logic in terms of the way Europe should react. The hard place is the politics of Europe, which is undermining Europe's ability to act in a coherent and muscular way to resolve, to prevent conflicts and to engage in mediation.
Let's put that in a holding pattern. Wolfgang's already put it on the agenda. Anja, your engagement in these issues from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation.
Yeah.
Just introduce yourself and tell us what you do.
Yes. My name is Anja Langenbucher. I'm the director of the European office of the Gates Foundation. We just opened a second European office here in Berlin after having been in London, headquartered for the last almost 10 years now. And I think one of the drivers for this is certainly everything that was said about the responsibility, the increased responsibility of Europe that I think we must call upon. And when we took the decision to open an office here in 2016, we were saying we're heading into the 4 most important years in Europe with an aligned French-German election cycle, with the multi-annual financial framework being negotiated in the European Union. And today, I would say it is even more important because the crisis on the European Union level in terms of decision-making and being somewhat paralyzed still about the UK situation has been even more important. So this is the political background, I would say, why we decided to have a second European office here. The angle that we're taking on, on sort of a humanitarian crisis discussion is probably more one of health security, prevention, stability. What can we do to actually prevent some of these fragile states from being where they are? Because as we do think some of these crisis areas are, the consequence and the cause is very long-term underinvestment in really important areas such as security, and
does this kind of context mean you're having to have second thoughts about things you're investing in and where you're committing money?
No, absolutely not, I think. And we'll probably get to this later in the discussion.
Okay. Franz Fischler, as a former European Commissioner, but also President of the European Forum in Alpbach, Do your proceedings reflect very much what we've heard from Wolfgang in Munich?
Yeah, I can confirm what Wolfgang said 100%. I would go even a step further. I think one of the reasons why there is not much trust anymore amongst the national leaders in Europe has to do that we are not able anymore to have a real dialogue. What you get from Brussels nowadays is primarily information. They organize even information campaigns, which means information battles. And there is a huge difference, and this is what we have to learn again, what dialogue in the end means, that it is based on mutual trust, that it is based on common goals and so on. And therefore, I think I can only support the idea that we need qualified majority in foreign affairs. But if we would like to make progress in this field, because we are discussing this for 30 years now, yeah, so this is not a new issue. If we would really like to make progress, then I think we should go back to the initial idea of Jean Monnet, which would mean that it would be necessary to develop chapters within the foreign policy, because it is impossible to get an agreement that the foreign policy from year X is now a competence of the European Union.
Franz, can we park that for the moment? I just want to get your first take on what we've heard Wolfgang say. And you say you agree with him, but would even go further. But on the issue of Europe and what Europe does, that's one of the issues that Wolfgang has put on the agenda. But so can I just go back to something which is overarching here for all of you? It's about what leadership is prepared to understand about what's going on, whether they've got the nerve. You've just had a retreat in Elmau. What do you find behind the scenes, rather than being public in the hotel in Munich once a year? You're now developing a significant capacity around the world to hear from leaders privately and informally, confidentially, about their capacity to handle all this stuff. Do you believe they grip the enormity of some of the things you've said? Because that, if they don't, then we do have a very serious problem. Most are in hostage to their voters on the election cycle, but others not. And you deal with leaders who, frankly, if I can put it this way, are worried about their position, their ego, their survivability, even when they appear on your platform. So how honest are they prepared to be, Wolfgang, about the leadership deficit here?
Well, I don't think anyone who is serious, who is a serious participant in European political discussion
and internationally
and international discussion would dispute the fact that we have a very, very serious leadership problem. Look, I mean, even in this country, where unemployment is at an all-time low, where actually there isn't too much to complain about in Germany, even in this country, we spend the better part of a year struggling to even form a government, let alone take decisions. You mentioned Brexit. I mean, Britain is proud, and rightly so, of having been, as far as external policies are concerned, foreign policies are concerned, one of the thought leaders and one of the capacity leaders in the European Union for decades. Now, for the last period and for an probably indefinite period as we go forward, Britain is occupied with itself, and it's the definition of their role, etc. And you could take this, you know, even Emmanuel Macron, who started saying what we need now is une Europe qui protège, Europe that protects, a great motif, which I strongly supported. But now even Emmanuel Macron is preoccupied with his domestic situation. So we're all, and the same is true for Poland and Hungary and everybody else, so we are not, unfortunately, in a position where our leaders feel that they have the liberty of thinking about how can Europe actually try to be what we originally wanted Europe to be, namely an exporter of stability, a provider of security, not only to ourselves, but to others. We've been very, very deficient in this task, and I actually don't see an easy way out.
Can I just press you, because you did talk about the declaration of moral bankruptcy of our leaders, which goes beyond Europe. We have to look across the Atlantic. We now have to look at Latin America. We have to look at the Philippines. We have to look. You are inundated with leaders who want to come and talk for 10 or 15 minutes and project themselves. But what I'm trying to get is below the skin, to understand the enormity of this humanitarian and human rights issue, about whether they are prepared to confront the kind of issues that you've put on the agenda here.
Well, let's take a current issue, and I'm sure there are people here in this room who know a lot more about it than I. Yemen. Now, all our newspapers have been full for months about the terrible, further disintegrating humanitarian situation in Yemen. Are we doing something about it? Are we Europeans taking this into our hand? I think our answer has been a no answer so far. We wait until the United States decides maybe to stop supporting the Saudi-led coalition, etc. Are there not means at our disposal, Europe as the strongest economic bloc in the world, to try to stop such a conflict? And Nik, let me just add one important point. You know, I know that there are people out here who believe that, well, you know, maybe these types of conflicts, they just need to run their course for a bit, and then they'll all become tired of killing each other, and it will stop. Not only is that an morally unacceptable approach, but it is also totally and absolutely wrong, because we know from the experience of the last 2 or 3 decades that a conflict can be stopped, you know, as it develops. In the first phase, maybe it can be stopped, maybe it can be reversed. The longer it lasts, the more radical the forces become, usually on all sides. And you can write books about it, and then, of course, after 5 or 6 years of a Syrian conflict, it's very hard to come up with a patent solution of how to end
Michael,
this.
before you come in, what I'm going to do is say, for the next 25 minutes, I want to talk about this, about the international law must protect humans, not dictators, the kind of things you've put on the agenda about the moral bankruptcy of leaders, and even if you look away, you are guilty. So you've been monitoring, you've been working in those kind of areas. I want to hear from as many voices as possible. Then we'll move on to Europe for the last part of the session before 12 o'clock, if that's okay. So I'm trying to narrow down some of the issues that Wolfgang has put on the agenda. Michael.
I mean, what I was going to say is once a conflict continues, what happens, it becomes structurally very difficult to stop, because a political economy starts forming in which certain actors have an interest in the continuation of violence and of insecurity. And often, and I think this is a point that you referred to, Wolfgang, the response to these situations is an over-militarized one. It is not looking at security from the perspective of people, it is looking at security from the perspective of external actors. And that can often have a very distorting effect. If you talk to a Yemeni, or an Afghan, or a Colombian, or I mean, there are many people in this room, and ask them what real security is for them, it is not having a young man with a Kalashnikov at the end of their street that they don't know telling them what to do. It is about being able to move around. It is about being able to go to someone if somebody steals your cattle or burns your house or rapes somebody in your family or you, and I think one of the things that we've got to come to terms with is this political focus on security, which is completely understandable given what's going on, but making sure that it is not over-militarized, that our approach to security is comprehensive, that it includes human security, it includes justice, it includes basic local governance and accountability. And I think one of the crises we face is lack of trust in political leaders, the sense that they are no longer accountable to ordinary people in terms of delivering really basic services, including security. And, well, let me stop there.
All right, well, let's pick up on international law. Franz and Anja, can you come in as well? And anyone else, put up your hand and let's get the microphones moving around about particularly international law protecting, must protect humans, not dictators. Your language here, Wolfgang. It's tough language, but it's right at the heart of the problem.
Well, excuse me, but I would like to come in here with an additional thought. And this is, can we continue just to wait for political leadership? Or, in other words, is it possible that we get solution only from the politicians in the future?
Who else is there?
Who else? This is exactly my point. I think we need a new approach where we have functioning platforms between politics, business sector and the civil society. And if we develop such platforms, I think from that the necessary impetus could come to move forwards and to accept different approaches. If we all the time speak about the economic power of Europe, but why don't we then not include the business sector in the decision making? The difference between the past and the future would be that in the past such platforms worked in the following way. The politicians or politics invited business and others and listened to them, or even didn't listen to them, but there was not more. So there was not an agreement on the basic principles, so they were not negotiating, in German we say, auf Augenhöhe. And this is what is needed. And this would make a huge difference in my view. And therefore, we need also an internal reform of our democratic systems, because this is part of the democratic system. And if we don't move forward in that direction, we will not solve one single global problem, be it security, be it foreign affairs, be it climate change, be it
Let me put you on the spot here, because Wolfgang reminded us of R2P. We talked about this last night as well, Wolfgang. So you were just reinforcing the point, particularly with respect to Myanmar. And we've got a very distinguished person here who has seen the horror of what's going on. We've had 6 generals who've been accused of genocide based on the expulsion of 760,000 Rohingyas. How could a business have got involved in that? How could there have been intervention? Because this backs up exactly what Wolfgang was saying about international law protecting dictators, because even the UN was not allowed in to Myanmar.
Well, I think my approach is not an answer to everything, but
we need to debate it.
It is a better answer compared with what we have now. Yeah? In Myanmar, this is such an extraordinary situation, in my view, that
we all looked
the big
away.
mistakes were made already before the disaster started.
But by Wolfgang's analysis, we all looked away, and we're all guilty for not intervening.
Correct. That's the point. Yeah, and I think if you involve the civil society in the decision making, then the risk that politicians look away is lower.
Anja.
Yeah, I think we need to broaden maybe a little bit the concept of the humanitarian crisis situation from the perspective we're taking. I mean, we're looking away, certainly in many instances. I think we're also looking away on a daily basis on ongoing tragedies and emergencies that go on a daily basis. We have still 5.4 million children under the age of 5 dying in 2017, 15,000 a day. We still have, the probability of a child dying in sub-Saharan Africa is still 15 times higher than anywhere else in the world. I think these are tragedies that are ongoing on a daily basis. They're very destabilizing, because I think at the end of the day, it's these kind of areas that we look away in the same way and on an ongoing basis that create those conflicts or create fertile grounds for
But how do we stop that? How do we move forward?
I think we've heard a lot about lack of trust, lack of leadership, no good leadership, no consensus, even in rich countries such as the European Union. I think that is very true, which is why private platforms such as the ones you were alluding to, I think what we can do is at least in the background, while we need to tackle these problems, absolutely, but I think in the background we shouldn't forget about, as we call it, these ongoing tragedies that, will create that fertile ground for further conflicts, and keep on working on the things that we do know they actually work. I think we've seen a lot of convergence and much more better dialogue between development policy and foreign policy, security policy, humanitarian aid, which is much needed. Because I think, as you say, these foreign policy tools, both on the ground but also on the global level, need to come together and work in a constructive way. What we do know is there's enormous areas in our world where we do know they work. Public-private partnerships such as Gavi, the Immunization Alliance, it's saving 700 million, vaccinating 700 million children since 2000. Saving 10 million children's lives. This creates resilience and stability, access to healthcare systems, which I think are needed in these situations. We're talking about international law. I mean, we have this week was, I think, the anniversary of the Declaration of Human Rights. Article 25 there really calls that it is important for people to have access to healthcare, to dignity, to clothing, to food. I think these things, at least we know what we have to do in that area. And while we are paralyzed by, bad decision making, by political crises in countries like Germany, I completely agree. It's incredible that, in a wealthy country you cannot come to decisions. But I think we do know what works. And so I think concentrating on these areas and making sure that we create resilience in these countries, because we will have the majority of overseas development aid by 2030 going to fragile states. We will know where the poorest areas and population groups will live by 2030 if we look at the trajectory at the moment. So we do know where these crises will come our way. So I think the prevention is just as important and something we know what to do.
Can I give an example? Do you mind?
Please.
Things that don't happen don't get a lot of attention. I'm going to make a claim that I'm prepared to defend.
But if they're threatening to happen.
But we stopped a famine in Somalia in 2017. We stopped a famine in Somalia in 2017. At the beginning of the year, people thought there were 250,000 people at least were going to die. The consequences in terms of driving conflicts, let alone the misery that would have resulted, were catastrophic. It was stopped for a number of reasons. First, the humanitarians were much better prepared. Second, there was a real partnership with the private sector in terms of working through retail outlets, in terms of trying to keep prices down, in terms of mobilizing the Somali diaspora.
Describe the private sector to us.
It was small shops all around the country. The UN...
Indigenous.
Yeah. 700, 800 retailers were connected. There was an electronic scheme. If you could go to a retailer and reclaim things, the humanitarians realized you have to do this through the private sector. You have to use the energy of a society which tends to express itself through entrepreneurship and people wanting to make money to address this problem. You have to engage the private sector in these things. And we also made the argument politically that chaos in Somalia was not going to be good for business. And it's not a no-brainer, that argument, because actually, as I was saying before, a lot of people are making money out of chaos. But actually, stability in Somalia is good for business. So we had some of these partnerships, and we also had some good politics. You know, we supported an electoral process that was flawed, that resulted in a president being elected who was deemed as legitimate. And I think the lesson that I drew from this is that, you know, often humanitarian crises are the result of failed politics, of failure to address you know, disputes that can be addressed if you manage them, but also failure to engage everybody, civil society, the private sector, women, young people. You know, you need real partnerships.
Michael, let me just understand one thing. Let's all understand one thing. Who brokered that? How was it engineered?
You know, it was a multiple effort. You had the World Food Programme, you had UNICEF, but I was the SRSG. I was very engaged in talking to the private sector. We had meetings with the Somali diaspora. We had meetings with the president. I saw the president the day he was elected, the morning he was elected. I said, Mr. President, can you please convene the private sector, convene the faith leaders, convene everybody, and declare a national effort to prevent this thing from happening? And he did it. And then the donors, the other thing that made a difference is €1 billion was raised in a couple of months. Why?
From?
Oh, mainly Europe, actually, but also the US, Canada, some from the diaspora, but mainly Europe. And the reason that the donors did that is they looked at Yemen, and they looked at South Sudan, and they looked at other places that were facing humanitarian crises. And they saw one place where civil society and government and the private sector and the international community were all in the same boat saying, we're going to stop this. And they went for it. $1 billion came in very, very quickly. And it was amazing.
Have you created a new model there?
Amazing. I don't know if it's a new model. I wouldn't claim that, but it's a lesson that does need to be learned.
Ruben, quickly.
I'm so happy what you said, because it's exactly echoing what I want to say about we need to understand, when talking about business, for example, leaders, it's not only head of the big corporations, because we are managers, we're not the owner of the business. We're talking about technology disruptive people at young age. We need to be engaged in this discussion. Because, for example, some technology companies can solve many problems. They will be engaged and will know how technology can help some of the humanitarian issues. Nobody working with these bridges between the technology pioneers and bring the humanitarian issues. I believe the stakeholders, many stakeholders, need to come together. The only way it's a multi-stakeholder decision is not the politicians and not the old age people. I'm sorry, also say is young people with different mindset have different solutions, which we are not engaging them to part of the solution discussion. The other point that I want to say about the Rohingya issue is, or other issue, is transparency. We need to use this advantage of technology to be transparent about everyone. We all know who paid money, which banks. Look, John Pettigrew, our president, member selection committee, doing very specific investigations. How this all genocide was financed by whom? Which banks and were paying? It's very easy. We can publish this information, and then we need to use this transparency for bringing in attention people before it's all becoming unavoidable, already non-stoppable. The third point I want to raise, just more question. We're talking about dictatorships, but we need to understand the problem that we're facing, all of us. With almost 90% of dictators was elected by people. We're not dictators by God the power by themselves. This is why we are challenged what we're facing in US, in Russia, in Turkey, or in China, or in Europe, or urban or other. We've been elected. The question, what we need to do with the people who become elected, what their behavior is unacceptable from point of the human life. This is why I think it's very clear, much more danger situation what we're facing today. Because before it was easy. Oh, Saddam Hussein or Assad, this was not elected, this was mainly. Now we're talking about people who've been elected and they're ultra left or ultra right. How we handle this issue, I don't know.
Anja, is this something that, I mean, when you listen to what Michael has described, is that something that Gates would be investing in and committing to? Because obviously it's prevention, it's creating a new environment in which probably there's less medical, fewer medical issues, which is after all what you're set up for.
Yeah, so our line of business, so to say, of course, is much more in the prevention and the research in the long-term, investment in things that we do know, but of course in the prevention of famines and the prevention of epidemics.
Just stabilizing society. That's
stabilizing society, absolutely. I think every actor should do what they're best at. And I think while we come in with funds and with assistance in humanitarian crisis, we did during the migration crisis, we did have, contributions to the crisis in Yemen. This is not our strongest point. And I think at the end of the day, every actor should do what they do best. Ours is we are impact measurement. We see very clearly what long-term measures prevent these crises from happening. We're not a political actor. So I think from this perspective, we should do what we do best.
You're not a political actor, but you are a contributor at critical moments.
Yes, absolutely. That is correct. I do think the point on transparency, which also going back to the platforms, is a very important one, because we've been through many areas where we are a very influential player. So we do need to address the point of being very transparent at many instances. For example, our investments, our support to the WHO in crisis situations, what we do in our polio areas, our involvement in the Ebola crisis. I think transparency is very important for any new decision-making body to be effective.
You're getting a lot of people who want to contribute here, but you want to speak, or?
He's before me.
Well, I want to talk about the Rohingyas, because when we think back to what was happening 15 months ago, a year ago, given the determination of the military regime in Myanmar to keep everybody out, to not know what was going on, to kick 800,000 people out into eastern Bangladesh, could the private sector ever have been involved, given that even UN representatives were not allowed into the country? I mean, it sounds idealistic, but when you hear Michael's experience, which is positive, when we think about the genocide, which is now officially declared as having taken place in Myanmar, could that have been prevented with the involvement of other actors, including the business sector, do you believe?
Yes.
Just describe who you are, please.
I'm Zani. I was with the LSE Civil Society and Human Security Unit. I'm now a full-time activist working with and for the Rohingya, because I'm Burmese from Burma. This issue has been known to the United Nations as well as to the private sectors, particularly corporations that have been investing in Burma in the last 25 years. The word human crimes against humanity have cropped up in every single UN report since 1993, when the UN Special Rapporteur mandate was instituted. So we don't have, neither the global society, nor the private corporations, nor the governments have an excuse of we don't know. We do know, we have the information. But genocide in the case of Burma, like in any other cases, it's not a profitable business. It's not a geopolitical advancement. Therefore, no actor, private or public or UN, finds it in its interest to intervene. So we have an extraordinary situation, like, the militia that were instruments of the genocide in Darfur is now funded by the European Union, because they don't want, they are being used as a border guard force to stem the tide of, the Africans fleeing. So on the fragile state question, I think we are putting too much focus on single individual states and actors outside the wealthy, advanced European and Western zones. These fragile states are the products of the geopolitical equations that were formulated in the heart of Europe and United States. And finally, could we have stemmed the tide of the 800,000 Rohingyas that were being criminally deported, violently deported? Yes. The Burmese military leaders, some of whom are my friends and classmates, they have done several test runs. No genocide in history has ever been committed by a single state actor. They always have a coalition, whether Germany or Turkey in 1915, or, they have been given a blank check. And so they tested the water. They realized that there was no political will to stop what they were about to do.
Thank you, Franz. But let me pick up at that point, and Wolfgang, I'd like your reflection on this principle of the involvement of business. There you have it, and I'm summarizing it crudely. There's no financial advantage in challenging genocide for a company, and that therefore is quite a limiter. And I'm putting it crudely.
Well, I would say there is no miracle, and there's not a single instrument with which you can resolve everything. Yeah,
but the motivation of business getting involved along the lines of your model.
The motivation of business getting involved is in principle clearly that they would also like to make profit, at least in the long run. There's no doubt about that. But the engagement and the expertise of the business sector can make a lot of things much better. If you think about, for example, famines, we heard the example there, it works very well if you do it the right way. If it is about genocide, then the situation is different. There, I think we must be aware that we need a set of different measures with which we can solve a big number of the problems. For example, here, in my view, the weakness is that we don't have an enforced international law. Yeah? The international law is more of a declaratory character, and if the law is not accompanied with forces, then it is very easy to ignore it. And I think in this respect we need changes. Wolfgang made some examples how we could change that, but we must do it.
Wolfgang, I mean, you're at the interface between political leadership and business, even more so at MSC now. What is your reaction, your thought about this as a new avenue, particularly after you hear Michael's success there, which was little reported, most people are unaware of, but actually because it was a success?
Well, I think it's a very, very interesting case, but of course there are many other cases. What I think is very simple. I think the power of civil society, the power of business coalitions has been multiplied in the age of the internet. To some extent, we see cases where this power is now being, put to a negative use. The Gilets jaunes in France, you can argue some of their objectives are malign. They're not positive, maybe. But I think there are plenty of examples where this power, this enormous energy, which can be generated if civil society coalition, business, etc., get together, can be put to good use. Look, I mean, take the case of the Germans. Whatever people may think about the, the national characteristic of Germans, I know, because I've lived through it, Germans tend to be, if you tell things to them in the right way, they can be extremely generous. They can be the most generous nation on earth. Post 9/11, you know what the German business community and individual Germans did? They were the one nation that gave more money to the families and etc. of the victims of 9/11 in the Pentagon and the two towers in New York than any other nation on earth. Through my embassy at the time, we were the collecting point, we collected more than $60 million within weeks. Uschi Müller was actually part of the team of my embassy at the time. And that just tells you that if you have the right message, and if you have a good messenger, you can get people and the business community to do enormous things that transcend quite often the power of, the average European small country, small nation state.
Would you see that as the way forward when political leaders, by your own analysis, have got moral bankruptcy on these issues? Is this a new way forward to at least experiment with?
Oh, absolutely. I think we should try to find a way to transcend what has been called over the last couple of decades the CNN effect. That our governments only start waking up to humanitarian tragedies when they see somebody, drowning in a catastrophic flood in Mozambique, a woman with a little child, and then people say, "Oh, maybe we should do something about it." So, starting early, making people get involved is now, in 2018, so much easier. You can start a waking up process for wide segments of the population overnight. In 48 hours, you can get hundreds of thousands of people to subscribe to a certain idea and to put some degree of pressure on the decision makers in your country or in Brussels or elsewhere. The power of the people has been multiplied through modern internet and social media technology, and it should be put to good use, and it can.
That's what we're looking for, real innovation. There are a lot of people who've got their hands up, so please be patient. We've got 40 minutes to run, so just be patient. Don't overuse your time. Sunita, you wanted to speak first.
I just want to flag a possible solution. While we talk about the real world with moral bankruptcy and barriers in terms of trust and everything, there is another world that is parallelly happening, the cyber world and the virtual space, which is more borderless, more egalitarian, more ageless, and there seems to be better scope for what Christoph said of hope and dialogue in this space. While we need to recognize the security concerns of the cyberspace, but can we leverage this space for creating better hope and dialogue among humanity as a whole? Because at least here, there is no borders, and humanity as a whole can come in one platform.
Right, microphone to Maggie. I'm going to go over here. Remember what Christoph also said, the trap of righteousness.
Thanks. I want to pick up on a security theme I'm hearing and also offer a solution and a new innovation. My name is Sasha Chanoff. I lead an organization called Refuge Point, which finds solutions for refugees. Wolfgang talked about the crisis in Syria in 2015 when the World Food Program ran out of money. That triggered a mass migration of people. Tom yesterday talked about how the Janjaweed are now being paid to stop forced migration. MSF highlighted the loss of life.
And they're not called the Janjaweed anymore. The Rapid Support Force, I think they're called.
MSF highlighted the loss of life in the central Mediterranean. What we're seeing right now is that more and more people are on the move. More than 70 million people have been forcibly displaced from home, and the average amount of time someone is a refugee is nearly 25 years. The UN is on the eve of adopting the new Global Compact on Refugees, which has as a pillar self-reliance for refugees, because we see that food and emergency aid year after year doesn't work anymore, and that's why people are risking their lives in dangerous and deadly onward journeys. There's a new initiative in the world that aligns with the Global Compact on Refugees, which is the Global Self-Reliance Initiative for Refugees. This is a coming together and a collaboration that the Aurora Prize actually announced in September around the UN General Assembly of Refuge Point, Women's Refugee Commission, the IKEA Foundation, the UN Refugee Agency, governments, and other leading NGOs in the world to find ways that refugees can become self-reliant and to support the host communities in the countries to which they've fled so that they don't have to risk their lives in dangerous and deadly onward journeys, and so that they can find the ability to support themselves and even contribute to their communities. And that's the way that we can help to address some of the forced migration today.
Thank you. I'm going to come to you at the back. Can we get the microphone to you? Maggie, next.
Yes. I am frustrated because the example of Burundi, I come from Burundi. And you know that European Union and the UN pay each month Burundian government $5 million to pay the soldiers in Somalia, Burundian Somalia. And they know with this money that UN and European Union pay is to pay militia who kill people in Burundi. And everybody, I don't know, because we have been in European Union to denounce that. We have been in UN to denounce, because in Burundi, you must know that there is no human defender, because all Burundian, they freed the country. All journalists, independent journalists, in media, they freed the country. We are 500,000 Burundian out of the country, and when we go in UN organization, when there are conferences, nobody speaks about genocide, who is preparing in Burundi. And it's with your money that our dictator used this money to kill their people. And when we asked the government, UN, they said, oh, there is sovereignty. But we know that in the responsibility to be protected, they signed that, they ratified that in UN security. But we are here. Who will do that? You, European, you must stand up, civil society from here. We must speak loudly, but there is interest. It's geopolitical problems.
Thank you, Maggie.
Yeah,
That's really chilling, and it builds on what Tom was telling us yesterday about the Janjaweed. The rapid, I'm getting it right, am I? The Rapid Support Force now, which is sounds rather different to the Janjaweed. Are you familiar with this, Wolfgang? Yes, it's quite remarkable the turnaround there's been in the Nuba. Let's keep pushing if we can, please. And it's important to hear from the next generation as well. This is not about being patronizing. It's your world that we're creating for the future. So what's your view? And tell us who you are.
Sorry?
Tell us who you are.
I'm Gustav from Denmark, currently studying at UWC Robert Bosch in Freiburg. I hear a lot of you guys talking about how we need to make international laws and international agreements, but I don't see the reason for doing that when we have seen time and time again that these laws and the agreement have been shunned upon or just forgotten by states such as Denmark under, for example, the refugee crisis, where we all had an agreement that we would go together and share the load. And as soon as the problem became too harsh for us, we decided to say, we're going to close our borders, we're going to send them to Sweden, we're going to let them stay in Germany, we're not going to help them. When I worked for the Red Cross, I experienced that firsthand, where 2 boys had to get their papers back from Syria of their dead father's death. And even after that, the Danish government said, well, we can help you. We're going to send you back to Italy because that's where we first registered you guys. So how is your opinion on us wanting to make all these laws, but in reality we don't see them really working?
Well, that's what Wolfgang put on the agenda. Let's keep pressing that for the next 10 minutes before we turn to Europe. Anyone want to come in on international law and how it's protecting dictators as opposed to helping humans? Please, the 2 of you here. Who's got the microphone? And at the back as well.
Thank you so much for giving me
yourself,
the floor.
please.
I'm the former Minister of Justice in Germany and very, let's say, interested and, let's say, member of the International Coalition for an International Criminal Court, which indeed is one of the very few, let's say, enforcement instruments of international law. But what we can see now at the moment in quite different regions of the world, that the meaning and the power of the International Court is, let's say, systematically weakened. And I feel that the businesses or civil society could do quite a lot in working against that, because what happens now is that what Mr. Ischinger said, it's protecting dictators and it's not protecting people.
What has to change?
You have to change, let's say, you have to, in the social media, in the normal media, you have to raise your voice and say, this is a good code. You have to do that in Africa, where the weakening is most visible at the moment. You have to do that in the context of Syria and Darfur, because it's the civil society, it's the media, it's business that do not care what's happening with the ICC at the moment.
Do you think visibility and transparency of the horrors taking place in a way which we didn't have in the Balkans?
You can raise your voice, civil society can raise its voice, businesses can raise their voices, and they don't do it because they fear to come over cross with dictators. And secondly, I think that Franz Fischler is quite right. We have to change our electoral laws because we know quite well that decisions are made in parliaments. So let's open wherever we can the decision making, and let's get, let's say, civil society lists into it. There are proposals for that, but I won't, let's say, go into that further now, but we can discuss this afterwards.
But quickly, do you believe that the power and the influence of the International Criminal Court can be reasserted or
yes,
not?
Yes, sure, because if you look into the news media, if you look into social media, you can see that the interested, let's say, power players say, okay, why should we put Mr. Assad before the ICC? It needs, let's say, the vote of the Security Council. Why should we, let's say, put al-Bashir before the International Criminal Court? There has been a Security Council resolution on that, but nobody cared for it in the UN family. They are receiving him. Germany is giving him money for him to stop the refugees. We know that. All this must be put into the public. And we can do that not only about traditional media, but social media as well. If you look into that, there has been a movement for the enforcement of international law, for, let's say, a responsibility to protect in the 90s. And it's not more, and that's what civil society can start again.
Move the microphone behind you, please, at the back. On this issue of international law, please.
Yes, I have a concrete
Just
question.
Introduce yourself, please.
I apologize. Michael Wirtz from Washington. I have a concrete question for Ambassador Ischinger because I think it was so important that he called out the fact that there are autocratic regimes in the immediate neighborhood of Europe that not only disregard international law, but also make human suffering and civil war part of their foreign policy leverage. And Ambassador, I was wondering, it would be fairly easy in this room here to create consensus that longest term development and international law are common sense policies. But given your broad experience, how do we find proficient and effective arguments when we talk to more traditional diplomats, to people in the national security environment or even in the military, to argue that this is not only an humanitarian add-on, but key part of national interest-driven policies?
Can you just store that for one moment, Wolfgang? Let me get another contribution here, please.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Volker Westerbach. I'm a medical doctor and president of MSF Germany, Doctors Without Borders here. Thank you, Mr. Ischinger, very much for bringing up the issue. And I can just underline that international law nowadays not only backs up dictators, it does also stop humanitarians from helping people in need. And we are, as you know, we are in Yemen, we are in Rakhine, we are in Syria, also in Turkey, and also in Europe, actually. These international laws stop us and others from helping people. And as much as I do appreciate, and I think we need business intervention, civil society initiatives, I think there were some really good ideas here. I think we must not let governments off the hook. I think it's super important that they take their responsibility. But, and that would be a question to you, opening the Pandora's box of reformulating international law, will we end up with having nothing in our hands anymore given the current climate? Or if we are bold enough, do you think we will be able to strengthen these laws, including impunity mechanisms and so on?
Please, on international law. On international law? No, it's you.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
Please, would you like to talk about international
Yes.
law? And introduce yourself, please.
Regina Pöttke from the Roland Berger Foundation. I have a question to the panel. But at first I want to thank Wolfgang Ischinger for his "yes we can" or "yes we could if we would" speech. Yesterday there came an interesting idea from the audience. I don't know who made this, who had this idea. It was an idea about another council, an international council, parallel to the United Nations, because United Nations decisions can be blocked because of the veto right. So sometimes United Nations can do what they are invented for. Yeah? Two questions. Do you think, is it possible to change the regulations of United Nations? I think no, I don't know. Or do you see a chance for a union of NGOs worldwide to strengthen the civil power? And I think we in Germany have examples enough. One of these examples is our peaceful reunion. forced through civil, to strong civil power. Yes.
All right. Thank you. I'm going to propose that we spend another 3 or 4 minutes on this, and then we move on to Europe and the issues that have been put on about Europe, particularly, and then we'll, Wolfgang, if you can answer that question over there, but those particular questions there about changing the regulations of the UN, of a new union of NGOs, and the other issues about international law as well. Can you, Michael, give your perspective, having worked for the UN in several missions recently?
I mean, first of all, I think we shouldn't fiddle with international law, because in today's environment...
You mean don't change it?
If you try and reform it, you're going to end up with something worse, whether it's refugee law, humanitarian law, international law. The issue is to get it applied.
Is there agreement among you all about that?
Well, it's just
Don't
interesting.
change
The conversation hasn't been about changing it. It's been about applying it and getting it respected. And that's a very important point, because if you start mucking around with it in today's toxic political environment, I think things are going to end up being worse. And I think it's really important that people understand their rights. And I think that's a very important starting point, and that they hold those who have authority over them accountable. Second point I would like to make is that there's this Janjaweed point and several references to militia. I think in terms of security, one of the things that we can, and this is an idea maybe, I'm not sure it's an Aurora idea, but one of the things that we simply do not do consistently enough is look at the economics of security forces and the politics of security forces. We often approach security forces as if it's some kind of technical issue about ability. We don't look at acceptability, we don't look at accountability, and we often don't look at affordability. If a country cannot afford its own security forces and they are paid by outsiders, you are immediately vulnerable. And ideally, every country needs to be able to afford its own security rather than be dependent upon external actors, because that makes it extremely vulnerable. And I think a much more consistent approach is required. The third thing, Nik, I just want to say is I love Franz's idea of a platforms for partnership in this area. I think that is really, really interesting. And I, for one, would be willing to take it forward if it comes out of this discussion. The very final thing, I hesitate to say this to you, of all people, Nik, but I do worry that conventional media is feeding the egos of politicians who are using it as theatre. There is so much theatrics. We are giving oxygen through conventional media to politicians who demonize migrants and who interpret security in various ways. I think it's a very dangerous trend, and you can't blame. I've worked in the media as you have. You've got to be careful about how you approach this. But there is a certain amount of oxygen being given to politicians, I think, who are grandstanding and feeding negative narratives and demonizing people in society. And I don't know quite how we deal with that one.
Anja and Franz, before I go to Wolfgang, the changing of the regulations of the UN, a union of NGOs. Anja, your view?
Just briefly, maybe, I think I want to give the example of the SDGs, which I think are at least something that, a wide majority of countries agreed to. And then I think afterwards, after you have such a platform, then you can bring all of these, the influencers, the business sector, the private sector, the civil society. But I think you have to have some justification and authority of a process having gone through and having found very broad consensus on something. Because I think it is equally a dangerous road, as we've heard from MSF, to say we don't want to go down the road of letting governments off the hook. I think that you need to anchor, kind of the power of the private sector or the power of civil society and influencers on something. And I think, again, the SDGs to me are a good example. They need everyone, business, private, public, governments, to be enforced and to be seen through and to pushed for and held accountable. But I think you need to have, sort of a broad-based global consensus and authority of something. So from that perspective, I think with regards to using the force of civil society, absolutely. And I think we are, even, from our perspective, supporting information, through our digital work in financial services for the poor, for example. We are increasing very effectively in many countries information processes to government payments, for example, which has a huge impact on, transparency, corruption. But again, civil society is not always one opinion.
Franz. Franz.
Well, the last sentence I think is really important, but also what was said before in the context of let those who govern not off the hook. And I think it would be a big misunderstanding if we would understand this platform concept as a concept that allows those who govern, the politicians, to blame others or to give the responsibility to others. I think it could be, if it's done in the right way, quite the opposite, that the politicians are much more forced from the civil society and from the business sector to make the right decisions and to make decisions in due time. So I think it would also enforce the whole decision-making process. But your last point, and you made also this point, the problem with the media. I think we should be aware that the influence of the traditional media is decreasing everywhere in the world. And decisive are more and more the new media, the social media, and so on and so forth. And I think here there's another weak point which we are facing, and that is that in this area, with this new media, the opponents against liberal democracy and those who would like to destroy our values, they are at least technically usually much better than the defenders of the liberal democracy. And I think if we don't change that, then we are also in this field on the loser side.
And the trolls are also part of the new media, coming from St. Petersburg and Shanghai and other countries. Christoph, and then Wolfgang.
I'd love to combine what Anja said, what you, Franz, said, and what you said. I think those platforms are really a chance, which are possible now and haven't been possible in the past, because we have the virtual space. We have other means of communication, of transparency, to combine and to cooperate. And I think the SDGs are the new basis we have to give credibility and to give orientation to such platforms, because they cannot operate in open subjective space. But the SDGs are here and they're agreed upon. And the possibilities of virtual space is here, and the younger generation is able to travel it very well. So those platforms have a chance they never had before. So I believe this is really a chance.
Wolfgang, then we'll move on to Europe. That point particularly, question to you, and also international law, what you've heard, particularly the difficulty of humanitarians working under international law. It restrains them.
So many interesting points were made.
Sorry.
Let me use a concrete example to make the point that I think binds some of these arguments together. In the spring of this year, the question came up if Bashir Assad is considering the use of chemical weaponry again, is there a way for us, the international community, to prevent that from happening? I think a totally legitimate question, actually a necessary, morally necessary question. So what did the leader of one of our coalition parties in the current German coalition say? Without further ado, she said, and you know whom I'm referring to, she said, never ever will we be drawn into the Syrian war. Now, she answered a question that had not been asked of her. The first point. let me tell you what I think she should have said. She should have said, the first thing I want to say is that if Bashar Assad uses chemical weapons against his own people, he should be aware that he will end up sooner or later before the court in The Hague. Number one. Second, we want to make sure that the countries which argue that there can be no Security Council mandate because the sovereignty of Syria under President Bashar Assad needs to be protected is a perverse interpretation of current and future international law, because it ignores the fact that we have already for more than a decade had this fundamental decision to apply the responsibility to protect as a principle established by the UN General Assembly. So it's not, this is not about reinventing some absurd new international law. It's simply applying principles which have already been largely debated for years and which were cast in stone, so to speak, in the General Assembly in 2005. And last not least, I think she should have said, if all else fails, we believe that Mr. Bashar Assad should be aware that also for us and the rest of the international community, all options are on the table. All options are on the table. That doesn't mean that we will apply, that doesn't mean we'll fly bombs. It just means that we're trying to deter him from doing what he may have been contemplating of doing. That, I think, would be an expression of a responsible government reaction to these kinds of misuse of state power in the 21st century. So applying what we already have, as Frau Däubler-Melin mentioned correctly, we have the International Court. That is an advance in the international legal system of huge proportions. And we need to tell the US government that they are doing the wrong thing if they delegitimize the existence of such international courts, which is what the Trump administration is doing. And we should tell our friends in Moscow that they are using a perverse interpretation of international law if they believe that the only way to interpret current international law is to protect Bashar Assad. And let me add a political consideration to that. I'm not an advocate, I want to repeat that, of the use of military force. But I think that the existence and the continuing existence of dictators such as the one in Syria is, as far as we're concerned, the worst possible procedure for us in terms of preventing the next generation of terrorists. Because the longer this gentleman leads his country, the larger will be the number of young people who will be drawn into a fight against him. And the only way to fight against him, given the conditions in and around Syria, is to join one of these groups which are, by their very nature, radical. In other words, by not stopping this with the legal means and the political means and the diplomatic means, we are actually creating the threats to our societies as we speak. And that's not a great idea. Thank you.
There was that one question over there from the back, Wolfgang, as well. Wait, from the back, which I said, could we store right from the back, from the gentleman at the back?
What was the question again? I don't know.
Sorry, just wait.
The strategic argument for sustainable development vis-a-vis the national security community.
Well, Michael, of course, a government always has to make, educated decisions about what takes priority. Is it realpolitik that needs to take priority because of overriding economic, political, strategic interests, or can we advance the values of the human society? This is admittedly the most difficult day-to-day decision that responsible government leaders have to take every day. There's no one who can take that responsibility away from them. And I am not suggesting that there is a patent, perfect, pathway here. It's always weighing the pros and cons of how far you can go, how far you want to go, and how you can take your citizenry with you. Very difficult decision, and as I've tried to explain in the book I published a couple of months ago, the practice of foreign policy and security policy is not that in your day-to-day decision making you decide between black and white. There is most of the time it's not the perfect good decision and the obvious perfectly negative decision. Mostly you're deciding about shades of gray, dark gray, medium gray, light gray, and your challenge is to choose among 3 or 4 really bad options, the least bad one. That's often the practice of diplomacy.
Right.
Not happy diplomacy, but difficult diplomacy.
Now, we can have a vote, we can abandon lunch, but I don't think that's going to be much, there's not going to be much vote for that. But I did say we'd talk about Europe, and if we can just extend for 5 or 6 minutes, Daniel, please, on Europe, because I want to pick up, and I'm sorry it's 15 minutes later than I expected, but that's because of the richness of the debate we've had on international law protecting humans, not dictators. Standing on the sidelines, I'm quoting again what Wolfgang said an hour ago, standing on the sidelines is not good enough for Europe because of that suggests guilt, essentially, for standing on the sidelines. Your ideas, please, about what Europe needs to do to engage itself. Please, Pavel,
yes.
From Zurich.
Exactly. Just 5 seconds to introduce myself. First of all, your Moscow friend, as you referred. I'm here to represent the Russian people. I am a proud dual Bulgarian-Russian citizen, resident of Switzerland and representative of UBS, the world's largest wealth manager, 2.3 trillion under management, so I think we have a lot to talk about.
Now Europe.
Now Europe. I would like not to say what we should or would
When you say we, what do you mean by we?
The global society, civil community. One, I think, important culmination of today's meeting is the proposal already made by the lady about a union of NGOs. A union of...
Look, Pavel, can we just talk about Europe? I did say I wanted to talk about Europe at this stage, please.
So,
about Europe standing on the sidelines. That's
Europe standing on the sidelines can get involved by participating in a public-private union that would make the young generation aware of all the problems in the world and that would be able to make a change. This is what I wanted to bring to your attention. A public-private partnership, a union of unions, the next UN, if you will, that will make a difference in this world, and that organization has already started in Moscow. Would be a pleasure to continue to talk about it later.
Right, Europe, please. Anyone else, any other ideas on Europe, please, at the back there. But can we keep it specifically the next 10 minutes only on Europe standing on the sidelines and is therefore guilty?
Well, I was going to say that Europe can provide a solution. So you talked about platforms and emerging platforms. Well, I've established the World Health Innovation Summit, which is a platform to bring communities together to empower them. And it's actually a civil movement. So that's a solution.
Would you like to talk about Europe?
Yes, I have. So my name is Fadl. I am from Babylon, Iraq. And speaking from my experience, I noticed that there is a huge gap between what's happening on conferences and what's happening in real life. So to what extent can Europe and the international community in Europe help in when they face political friction with the local governments that was elected in those countries that has conflicts?
All right, thank you. Europe only, please. Europe on Ingrid, please. But can we just nail this down? Europe standing on the sidelines. Please, with the microphone.
One point about Europe, I think, is the populism, that growing danger of isolationism and the neglecting of multilateralism and the community that has to fit together. And apparently there is a phenomenon that we have left people behind for decades, and now they are protesting in a way we haven't expected, and we have to deal with this extremely urgently, because otherwise all the power Europe has to have is damaged.
Please. On Europe only, please. Europe on the sidelines.
Absolutely. I'm African European, living in Europe, in Brussels. I run an organization that's a membership organization for foundations. I've been to about 4 or 5 conferences this year where people have been talking about precisely this problem. And the issue is that we oversimplify. It seems to me that when we talk and when we listen to each other, we're actually accepting the complexity of the issue. But then when it comes down to the final few minutes of a conversation, it's what can you say that will fix the problem? And the problem is there is not one thing that will fix things. We have to actually accept that things are complicated. And in Europe, we have learned for centuries, in fact, the art of realpolitik, of allowing things to happen, of compromise, of having to make choices between different gray issues. And unless we begin to address how we deal with that, we're going to have a major problem, because we'll continue to say, well, okay, looking forward to seeing you at the next conference.
All right, but great ideas can be expressed in a minute.
Yeah, I think Europe is not only guilty by standing at the sidelines, Europe is also actively guilty, as we had some examples from Burundi and Sudan. So Europe has a challenge actually to move internally and make sure that we ourselves stand to international humanitarian law, and at the same time also becoming more active internationally, because we need to be internally credible to have our voice here. So it's a double challenge for Europe, which I see very difficult to succeed in the coming years.
But do you fear that Europe is essentially marginalizing itself because of its own national political challenges now?
It definitely is, and it's participating not only internally in this marginalization, also in conflicts like in Yemen, it's actively participating. So Europe is losing its credibility and at grand pace.
So not on the sidelines, Wolfgang, please. Can we go over there? Just wait one moment, Ruben, please. I want to get as many voices as possible in the brief time. Roland Schatz.
Roland, Europe just has to go back to the law which was in place till 2001. Till 2001, everybody who wants asylum in Africa or anybody else goes to the embassy in his country, has it sorted out, yes or no, and when it is yes, for 300 euros they buy the flight ticket to the place in Europe, and they are accepted. It was the European politicians who changed that law and moved the responsibility to the airlines. Can we go back to this law which we had, number one? Number two, we have clear rules how public service TV networks should broadcast. We have enough politicians in the supervisory bodies of BBC, of ARD, of ORF, and these politicians are not following these standards, asking the journalists, is what you put on air, the way how you cover migrants, how you cover foreign countries, is this really in line with the BBC law or ARD or ZDF? Can we please simply do that? And the third very concrete solution is the F20. We have at every G20 summit, we have now the gathering of foundations who are offering their support during G20 summits. It's initiated by our German friend Klaus Mielke. We have great foundations in Germany who are starting that. Let's please put this in place and give these foundations the visibility they deserve. That's all we need.
Thank you, Roland. Ruben, I'm going to come to you. All of you, I'd like your final thought on Europe remaining on the sidelines, or that being the perception, but also the concern that Europe is still active in its own way. Quickly.
Very quickly, one suggestion. Libya, nobody touched. Europe got all the power. We took out the Gaddafi. no responsibility out of it. I think it's a Syria example. Why is Assad continuing in power? Because Libya, nobody taking responsibility after what happened with Libya. That's why Europe needs to take a lead and help Libya to become normal country. Otherwise, people say replacing dictator without after knowing what happened next is much worse. More radicalized, more. Is why Europe needs to take responsibility for Libya and take something to Libya become normal country.
Next year, there's going to be the European elections. There's also going to be a new European Commission. There's going to be a change in Brussels. And I'm wondering, Michael, as you survey, can I put it as the war zone of Brussels, where compared to where you've been, it's not quite the same war zone, how you will be focusing on this issue, which Wolfgang has put clearly on the agenda, that Europe is simply not asserting itself in the way morally and ethically it should.
Well, the way I'm a new kid on the block, but
that gives you an advantage.
Yeah. I mean, I think there are some examples of Europe effectively projecting its power. The JCPOA, for example, and I think there are 2 or 3 other cases which I hesitate to mention because somebody will jump down my throat and say I got it wrong. But I think there are a number of places where Europe has effectively projected its political power. And you have to work out why. And it's usually a combination of its political weight, its economic ability to reinforce its politics with real support, and I would like to think its commitment to values which resonate with the people who are affected. Now, if that is the case, the question is how can you, as it were, bottle and replicate that? And I think one of the issues is the degree to which member states of the European Union are prepared to empower the European institutions and the High Representative to project power and using the network of political representatives around the world. It's very interesting for me to compare the UN and the EU. Actually, as the UN, I was the SRSG for Somalia. I had much more authority and ability to do things, even though I had 193 member states breathing down my neck, than the European rep did with only 27. Well, what's going on there? Why is that? Why, in certain instances, are institutions given the space? Is it because they're deemed as having a better grip on the situation and therefore able to inform their membership as to what needs to be done? Is that the issue, coming up with compelling narratives, compelling analysis to which people respond? Is that it? Because if that's it, that's a way forward.
Anja.
Yeah, maybe just briefly. I mean, I think it's more the challenge for the European Commission at the moment and the Union. I mean, you mentioned the European elections in May. I think they're a huge risk. You had a complete turnover of the European Commission where you could very well end up with commissioners that are actually anti-Europe. I think that is a challenge that Europe needs to wake up to as soon as possible. I think you have a strange incentive mechanism in terms of getting the budget through, with the council kind of, playing not such a helpful role sometimes. I think it is really important that, the European Union focuses on the positive things that it has achieved and tries to really, take the risk and the challenge of these upcoming elections very seriously. We had in President Macron, I think, a very pro-European French leader, which is weakened and challenged at the moment through to domestic issues. So it's a long list. There are a long list of structural reforms, I think, that were needed there too. But most of all, I think it is the real challenge to put it back with the positive messages on the agenda, that the newer generation realizes that, in the wake of Brexit, in the wake of newer member states, really challenging the essence of the European values. I think it is really, really important to reiterate that through influential, through media, through everyone, what has been achieved. Because I think putting that at risk is, to me, one of the biggest risks at the moment on the table.
Thank you. Franz, as a former commissioner, do you see a sort of widening of the middle here, given the politics, the political reality? Forget about Britain, as we have to. The widening of the gap here between what is needed and the political imperatives being created by nation states within the European Union.
I agree with you. Yes, this is widening. And you can see this especially if you look what the Visegrad countries at the moment are usually doing. Yeah? They don't test anymore where is the common ground. They test the opposite. they test the frontiers, how far they can go, so that they not risk to get a procedure which could end up then in losing their vote. So I think it is absolutely necessary that, and this will come out in the election campaign of the upcoming European elections, we must put the question in the middle of this campaign: what would we like to do in common in the future? This is no longer clear, and this is our fundamental problem, I would say. And coming back, what you asked, is Europe staying at the sideline?
Well, it's Wolfgang.
Yeah, I fully agree. Yes, it is. And the best symbol for that is if you go to the Assembly of the United Nations and look where the seat of the European Union there is. Yeah? It is beside the Vatican and as an observer. So we are really on the sideline. And I think this is an example where we could change the competences that we are able to speak with one voice, at least in international institutions. This could be a starting point for quality majority voting.
So can I put the last point to Wolfgang, because
only
I'm looking at my watch.
Yeah, because it was said that we are also involved in conflicts. But here I think it is necessary to make a difference between the union as a union and the member states, because in many cases certain member states are simply in the wrong camp. So they are not staying at the sideline, they are in the wrong camp, and this is a big difference.
Wolfgang, your final thought about Europe, particularly Europe on the sidelines. Do you fear that in a few months' time you'll be saying it's even more on the sidelines, if even the complexion of the new Commission is more nationalistic and there's more national pressure, which means that the spirit and the principles of the Union are less about a union anymore?
As a diplomat, you've got to be in principle an optimist.
But you've moved on from that, haven't you?
No, and I am an optimist. What you asked for my final comment on this. Look, this country, the country I live in, Germany, has been accused over the last decade of throwing its weight around. The Greeks have been unhappy with us. Just yesterday I read that some of the concerns in the Brexit debate is that the EU is nothing but an instrument of German power, which is probably a very wrong way of thinking about the European Union. But this idea of Germany being the dominant power is, of course, a very dangerous idea, because it really poisons the essence of the European Union. So what I think is this. I'm delighted to see that both the German foreign minister, who comes from this part of the coalition, and the chancellor, who comes from the other part of the coalition, have said publicly that they are in favor of a future of qualified majority voting. So what I would hope that the German government would do after the European elections, after, you know, everybody, all the posts are all filled, I would hope that the German government would initiate, in a very formal way, a proposal to start a process of creating step by step qualified majority voting. What would that do? That would, in and of itself, eliminate these soupçons, these suspicions that the Germans are only out to use the EU for their own national purposes. It would, with one stroke of the pen, make sure that everybody can have confidence that Germany is prepared and willing to use its own role, stability, economic power, political power, etc., to the benefit of a more credible, more respected, more capable European Union. Thomas Mann, it's a quote I love, said in 1953 what we should strive for is not a German Europe, but a European Germany. And that's what it's all about. Thanks.
Thank you, Wolfgang. Thank you to everybody. And particularly for your remarks, which in the sandbox that you've created here have resonated, and I think will resonate because each of those could have justified a longer debate. And so I regret not having had the time to be able to expand on so many of those critical things you've mentioned. Wolfgang Ischinger and everyone, thank you very much.